Hey class. So today we're going to be we're going to continue working with the Declaration of Independence. We've been working with it for about a week now. So we have a firm grasp of what it is, what it represented, and how it's an important part of who we are as an American people today. But today we're actually starting this really new assignment. It's going to be a culmination wrap up of this entire unit that we've been working from. It's going to consist of, we're going to be producing a piece of advertisement so that you can distribute that to your fellow classmates, and you're going to present it to them in an attempt to try to sway them to join the revolutionary cause, right? So we want to keep an eye out for being persuasive, and also using primary resources like John Locke, and just really trying to stress those inalienable rights that were mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, and how underneath the British Crown they don't have those same rights, and under a new America, we don't have a name for it at this point in our time frame, but you know, as a new united people, they will have those rights. So just keep an eye out for all of those things as we're going through this presentation, and then when you come into class tomorrow, you will have been prepared and been really just digesting a lot of this information, so you should be more equipped to start the assignment of creating the actual advertisement. Okay, so take notes, follow along, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or ask me them tomorrow. There will be some videos and a couple of other things that you might want to just reference back to. So in this slides, or within these slides, you will also have access to the content, actual slides without this video, so you can go back and reread and watch the videos for yourself. Okay, so let's move on to. So we're going to start here with no taxation without representation. We already know about this. We learned about the Sugar, Tea, and Stamp Act. This is just understanding that how the colonists used the No Sugar, Tea, and Stamp Act, or those specific acts, as fuel to inspire individuals to join the cause of revolting against Great Britain, right? So what's important here is that we recognize that the American spirit, even back then, was just low taxation. They do not like to be taxed. They don't like their money being taken away from them, ever. Even though the Stamp, Sugar, and Tea Act were not egregious taxes being levied against them, they were still being levied. Any amount was too much, according to the colonists. So remember, there was all that war debt from the French and Indian War, and so the colonists were just, or Great Britain was needing to fund that and pay for the debt that they accrued, keeping the colonists safe. So they thought, oh, let's wage these taxes against the colonists, and then they'll have to pay for it. The colonists didn't like that at all. So just keep in mind how the American spirit is just so sensitive with taxes, and understand that that was a crucial part of why they wanted to revolt against Great Britain and secede from the monarch. I also want you guys to take notes on all of these small pictures or paintings or photos, whatever the content is, because there's a few different versions of it. Keep an eye on all that. Take notes. We're gonna have a small brief discussion tomorrow during class, just so that we can all make sure that we understood what all of those pictures were representing and what you wanted to glean from that information. Okay. So next we have, we're actually going to compare and contrast Hobbes and Locke. So you guys have heard a lot about Hobbes and Locke, but I don't think we've actually done a direct comparison next to each other. So obviously Thomas Hobbes was a philosopher that theorized about the monarch, and how that people are naturally pessimistic and they can't govern themselves, and how the government is there to make sure that people stay in line, very authoritarian, very oppressive. And John Locke, other side of the coin, right? He promoted democracy, thought that individuals have rights that are bestowed upon them because of their creator, regardless of their religious affiliations. But just because you're a human being means that you have rights that cannot be taken away, and that Locke established that the government's sole purpose is to preserve those rights for everyone, regardless of who you are. Now, it turns out that the Declaration of Independence, and people from the time had a lot of restrictions on who was the person that had those rights. But you know, the American story is about trying to give those rights to everybody throughout our history. So this is just a direct comparison between those two. So I just want you to take a moment and see the differences and understand that there was the shift from almost like a class system that you couldn't move from, that you were almost always going to be under the thumb of somebody, of your ruler, and how that shifts to inalienable rights, how that you now have this inherent intrinsic value to you that the government cannot take away. So just notice those things, understand that, and really emphasize the inalienable rights, because we're going to be using arguments for inalienable rights in our advertisements, okay? So over to this one, we also learned about the Boston Massacre, or the Bloody Massacre, as it says in this picture here. This is a recreation. This was actually being circulated back in the day, similar versions of this. So we all know the Boston Massacre was a deadly riot. It was in the 1770s. There was like March 5th, 1770. Soldiers were being agitated by a group of colonists that were outside. Some things were being thrown back and forth. Finally, the British people shot and ended up killing 5 colonists. Right? Obviously, this is tragic, and there isn't any excuses for it. But I think what's important is how the colonists reframed this massacre in a way that actually convinced the colonists that it was right to gather up arms and to go and fight the oppressive monarch, right? So it was a massacre. 5 people were killed, but it wasn't completely blameless. The mob of individuals, reports say that they were being very hostile. They were throwing glass. They were throwing snowballs with glass and rocks in them. They were throwing large bricks. They were really agitating the redcoats. So the idea that a group of redcoats shot onto an unarmed crowd is true, but when we had that little bit of context, you realize that maybe it needed a little bit of reworking within the propaganda department to try to be convincing. And so that's what actually happened here. The Boston Massacre was reframed by people like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams, trying to reposition this in the minds of the colonists so that they understood that, hey, these redcoats are oppressive people, and this is just a group of militia, a group of army that's going to be coming in here taking away our rights, forcing taxes upon us, and killing us in the streets without regard. So they reframed something that was already bad, and they just peppered in things to make it seem even worse, to try to drum up even more support. So take your time, ponder this piece, understand how that works with the advertisement and with propaganda in general, and then let's go and move on to the next one. So this is another piece that was circulated back in the Revolutionary era as well. It was basically, this is a symbolic snake that tried to represent how all of the colonies needed to unite together in order to take down the oppressive regime that existed in the oppressive monarch, right? All the colonies needed to come together as one singular unit, as a single snake. If one of them wasn't, say that South Carolina down here at the tail, say that it wasn't part of it, they wouldn't be able to be a successful army, and they couldn't actually finish the revolt. So it was a call for unity and a call for, and so this was just a symbolic representation of that unity. So I think it's important that we recognize how symbolism plays a really important part in trying to convince people and sway people into one side or the other. Think about how you would feel as if you were a loyalist back in the day and you saw these types of pieces being printed in newspapers or on flyers or whatever, and just see how that would conflict with your ideas, that you felt that we could preserve the relationship with Great Britain without having to fight or revolt against them. And likewise, think about if you were in the position where you were a part of the separatists who wanted to not still be a part of Great Britain, how this piece of persuasion would challenge your beliefs or maybe reaffirm your beliefs that we had to do it all as one unit. Again, please take notes of all these things because we're going to come back together and we're going to talk about your feelings about each one of the pictures in class tomorrow, okay? This is actually the fun one, guys. This is where those videos come in. There's 4 videos here. These are just famous advertisements that have either got notoriety through the internet or were famous back even before the internet, like the 1984 commercial. These are just some really clever forms of persuasion that modern companies do. So I wanted you guys to view these with a sense of intentionality. I want you to just notice how the authors of these companies try to convince you to think a certain way or feel a certain way or purchase a product, in what methods they use, what kind of symbols they use, what kind of imagery that they're conveying, whatever those things are. Take notes of that, bring them in, and we're going to discuss these in small groups about which was your favorite commercial, how effectively was it persuading you, and maybe some cons to it too, maybe some things that didn't miss the mark, you know, maybe things that missed the mark, that, hey, this doesn't actually work for me, it wasn't really a persuasive piece at all. Anything along those lines, because you're going to be able to potentially make commercials for your advertisement, whatever your small group decides. So just keep an eye out for those techniques. Lastly, I wanted to bring some of this information about no taxation without representation to the modern day, right? So we have examples of individuals or entities, areas that are being forced to pay taxes and being forced to have all the obligations of the nation without actually having any of the benefits. So a perfect example of this is modern day. Right now, Washington, D.C. Pays more federal taxes than 22 other states, and they have a larger population than more than 7 other states. So it's interesting that a huge population of people are not granted the same representation within our Congress that other states that contribute less to the overall budget of the United States are. So for perspective, if the country for some reason needs to raise federal income tax or change federal income tax, they go to Congress and it needs to be initiated in the House of Representatives because it's a tax and the tax has to be directly coming from the people. But say that happens, there's no representation for Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. So they have no way of trying to voice their own opinions about this particular piece of legislation. And thus they are being taxed because they still have to pay federal income tax without being represented. So it's the same exact conversation that was happening back in 1776 about no taxation without representation, except it's in our own borders today. Now there's arguments on both sides of whether or not Washington D.C. should become a state, and I implore you guys to just look into it and just talk about that with your families and just see what they think about Washington D.C. and statehood for it. Another example of this is Puerto Rico. Same thing. They are not entitled to representation within Congress or within the House of Representatives or the Senate, and yet they're still required to pay state taxes. So it's just a new, interesting way of thinking about how this isn't a problem that happened back in the day. This is a problem that has perpetrated throughout history, especially in a colonial America through the turn of the century and beyond, when we were much more imperialistic. So that's that. We're going to see you guys tomorrow. Make sure you come prepared. Have already watched this, taking notes, come in with all your questions, and so I can get some answers going. And then we're going to start creating our advertisements. You'll have a rubric available tomorrow, but tonight I just want you guys to think about creative ways of trying to convince your classmates and people of 1770s that, hey, we need to revolt against Great Britain. So thanks again, guys. I will see you tomorrow.